Good morning. Whoa. All right, nice and loud. My greetings to you from three churches that I interact with: Durkeetown Baptist Church, St. James Bible Fellowship, and One Life Community Church. Two of those are in Fort Edward, New York. I don't know how many of you know where that is, but it's northeast of here. Glens Falls, New York is where One Life Community is. You might be a little more familiar with Glens Falls. I live in Argyle, which is a little town to the east, really close to Vermont. I actually was born in Michigan and grew up my elementary school years in Austria. My dad was a missionary there, and then my high school years in Missouri. I went to college in Mississippi State, and so I kind of did the M's, and when I was done with the M's, I went to the N's and come to New York. Actually, I met my wife. She's from Newfield, New York, which is just south of Ithaca. And I met her on a missions trip. We got married in 1993, kind of shuttled back between here and Missouri because I was working with a ministry called Child Evangelism Fellowship. And then 2003, Durkeetown Church asked us to come up here and co-pastor Durkeetown Baptist Church. So we did that. We've been here since 2003. My wife Allison and I married in 93. We have 14 children, ages 28 through 3. And 10 grandchildren. And my oldest 5 grandchildren are older than my youngest boy, Izzy, so that makes for a really strange life. I tell people on every Friday, four of my grandkids come over, and they come in the door, they say, "Hi, Grandpa," and then they take off because they have peers to play with. They don't need Grandpa. They need to go play with my sons and daughter. So it's a strange grandparenting life, but it's the one that we have, and it's where we are. I know some of you know this book, not by this cover, actually, because this is an old cover. You would know it from this cover, probably, right? Don't Sing Songs to a Heavy Heart. And I'm going to use that today after I share the informational story, if you will, about Jackson Dee. I'm just going to share out of that some principles that are helpful when you encounter somebody who is going through grief of some kind of tragedy, suffering. It was interesting because I took our diaconate through a study in this a number of years before the whole thing happened with Jack, and what was a blessing in the outplaying of Jack's death and everything that came with that was how well our congregation had learned to put into practice some of these things. The story of Jack starts in October, I call it September 35th of 2012. And the reason I call it September 35th is I have a daughter who's born in October, and she was very adamant that she didn't want anybody else born in the same month as her. So when Jack was born on October 5th, at church, we put up the picture of him, and I put September 35th under that so that she wouldn't be upset. But he was born at home. He was named for General Stonewall Jackson. I don't know how many of you are familiar with General Stonewall Jackson. He's one of my favorite historical characters or people. And that was the first name. His middle initial is D. So my boys only have middle initials. They don't have middle names. And part of that was because we wanted to try and include. At the time, I didn't know I was going to have so many kids, and so my first son Ezekiel, I wanted to include my brothers and I in his middle name, so to speak, as a family name. And it's Matt, Mike, and Mark. So we just gave him the initial M, and then after that, that's just kind of how we did it with our boys. So D actually comes from Robert Dabney. Might be less familiar even than Stonewall Jackson, but he is the biographer of Stonewall Jackson, the best biography, I should say. And the reason it's the best biography is he was a contemporary of Stonewall Jackson and actually was an adjunct for him for a while during the war between the states. So he knew, and he was his pastor for a time as well, so he knew Stonewall better than all the people that are writing biographies now. So it's big, it's like 700-some pages, but if you like biographies, especially of Christian historical people, I just encourage you to read Robert Dabney's So that's how we named Jackson, which has always been to me humorous, because Jackson is a Republican Baptist Yankee, and Stonewall Jackson was a Presbyterian Confederate Democrat. So my hope is that when Jackson got home to be with Jesus, he got to meet Stonewall very early, and the two of them probably would think it was pretty funny how God brings people together. Fast forward to September 14th, and it's a September day in New York, pretty nice weather. Some neighbors were coming down to talk with me about our property line. They were new neighbors, and there was some confusion around about where our property line was. And the boys, or the kid, well, I guess just the boys at that point, some of my boys and a couple neighbors were out just riding bikes up and down this little dirt road that we live on. And I was in the back with these people, and my wife was getting supper ready. And suddenly there was just a loud scream, and it was Jack. Now, Jack had a tendency to exaggerate. He'd be up playing in the wood with the rest of the boys, and somebody like punch him in the arm or something, and you'd think they'd ripped his arm off. He would just scream. And I tried to work with him like, Jack, you don't have to like do that. You just understand it hurt and let us know that. But so the initial scream was sort of not real surprising. But my wife was worried. They were out riding bikes, and so she ran out and picked him up. And ironically, Jack's first words, I'm going to die, I'm going to die, I'm going to die. It must have hurt him pretty bad. What happened actually was this. He was riding behind his brother. His brother stopped quick. Jack didn't notice that and hit the back of his brother's bike and flew over the handlebars. And in the process of flying over the handlebars, his stomach hit the brake handle. And so the brake handle broke off, and that's as much as we knew at that point. We just knew he'd flown over the bars, and his stomach wasn't feeling real good. That was 6:30, September 14th. We took him inside, 2018. We took him inside and just laid him on the bed, and he was in a bit of pain, but he was good enough he could talk to us and all of that. And I guess we had eaten already by that point, because about a half an hour later, he just wasn't getting a whole lot better. He wasn't feeling a whole lot better. And we called a doctor friend of ours. We have a friend who's a doctor, and he does minor checkups like that for us. Nothing official. He's not our official pediatrician. But he'd come over and just check if one of our kids, we had one girl who it looked like she had her wrist broken, and he came over. He said, yeah, I would say it's probably broken. You need to go have x-rays done. So we asked him to come over and just check on Jack. Because here's the interesting thing. There was no bruise on his body. There was no blood anywhere. And he really wasn't in any sort of excruciating pain. He just was kind of uncomfortable. But he wasn't seeming to feel better, so we called John, and Dr. John came over. Dr. John gave him a thorough examination, pressing all over, checking him out, and said, you know what, I can't find anything wrong with him. If you want to take him in and have him do some x-rays or something, you could, but I don't see anything that's a problem. That was fine for us. We didn't feel a need to go to the hospital. Our kids do these things all the time. Oddly enough, right after he was done with that, Jack threw up. And again, Dr. John didn't think that was a big problem, probably just upset his stomach when he hit the ground or something like that. So he left. That was 7:30. And from 7:30 on, my wife just stayed right there in the room with my son Jack, just taking care of him. And I'm not going to tell you the whole story because I wasn't there for a lot of it. I was taking care of other things. I would check in on them. I would tell you this. I'll have some little cards available later that have a link to a podcast my wife was interviewed on, and it tells the whole story. And if you really want to hear the whole story from her point of view as his mother and caretaker, you can do that. But he was fine until later in the evening, and he started moving through the stage kind of a sort of an incoherency. This was late at night, and he just didn't seem to really be like all there. But we thought to ourselves, you know what? It's been this was like 1 o'clock in the morning, so it's been a long day for him. So he is probably just tired. He probably just needs to sleep. He hadn't slept or anything since then. Just laid in the bed. But interesting, throughout the entire time, he quoted a scripture for himself. And I'm going to have to find it because I'm going to forget it otherwise. And it's one that his mother had taught him, because Jack was a kind of fearful guy. He would be afraid of stuff all the time. He'd lay in bed and he'd be afraid. And so we taught him this verse out of Hebrews 13. The Lord is my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? Which is actually a quote from, I think it's Haggai 2:6 maybe. It's a quote from another text. Or perhaps it's Psalms. But anyway, we taught him that. And so he throughout that evening, would quote that continually. He would just say, the Lord's my helper, I will not fear. What can man do to me? Mainly just, the Lord is my helper, I will not fear. And he would just keep going through that. And he had an interesting point in there when he turned to my wife and he said to her, I just want you to know I'm sorry for any sin that I've ever done. Which just seemed kind of odd. These things were odd at the time. They make a whole lot more sense reflecting back now on what was happening in his life, but they seemed kind of odd at the time. About 2 o'clock, I had to leave the house because I drove a paper route as a sub for another guy who did it full time, and he was gone for a few days, so I had his route for 2 or 3 days. So at 2 o'clock, I said, I got to go. I said goodbye to Jack, and he seemed, again, like really kind of out of it. So that was the last I saw Jack alive, because I went on the paper route. My wife was still up with them, and and so, by the way, at this point, Jack had still never complained about pain, other than that initial hurt when he fell off the bike. He never complained about anything hurting him. And around 2:30 or so, he said to Allison, he took one last, went to the bathroom, and she remembers that he didn't walk right. Up until then, he'd been fine physically, but he sort of had this, kind of wasn't walking right. Again, she was just thinking, it's late, it's 2 o'clock in the morning, he's really tired. And then when he lays back down, he says to her, I hurt. And she says, where do you hurt? Because you've been just fine. He says, I hurt right up here, right on top of his head. Now, he hadn't hit his head. He had a helmet on. There'd been nothing to that. So she said, I think you're probably just really, really tired, Jack. Why don't you just go to sleep? So they both fell asleep. So he was in the bed with her. They both fell asleep probably around 3 o'clock. She woke up at one point in the middle of the night, and around 5-ish maybe, she says, she thinks it probably was, and she just put her hand over on him, and he felt a little cold, but that wasn't a big surprise. She had the window open, but his stomach felt kind of warm, which she thought was a little bit weird, but she just thought, we're just going to let this go until morning, and so she rolled over, fell back asleep. And she did something that my wife almost never does. She slept until 7 o'clock in the morning, and she's usually up around 5 or 6, somewhere in between there. But again, the grace of God, I think, kept her asleep until I was done, because I got done with the paper route right around 7 o'clock. And she woke up at 7. She turned over to Jack, and he was dead. It was obvious. He was cold. He was stiff. He was dead. Now, here's the first thing that went through her mind. And this was the grace of God in her life. First thing that went through my wife's mind when she turned over and our son was dead is, he's safe. He is safe. He's home and he's safe. If you ever go to my Facebook site, my little round picture is the game Sorry. You ever played the game Sorry? And in Sorry, there's a little circle that if you get there, you can't be put back to start ever and again. And it's my picture of Jack. He is home and he is safe. And so I'm driving a paper route. I'm just finishing up dumping the garbage from the papers and stuff, and I get a phone call. And my wife says, she tried to call me, and it didn't go through, and so I called her back, and she says, Jack is dead. And so I drove home. I was about 10 minutes from home, and I drove as fast as I could. I remember almost wrecking the van because I tried to avoid two squirrels that were in the road. Now, normally a squirrel gets in my way, I'm not too freaked out about it, and I don't hate squirrels, but if I hit it, that's it. I'm not going to kill myself to save the squirrel. But I remember thinking in my mind, there's been a death already. I don't want another one. And I remember also in my mind the intense emotion of wanting to be violent. Now, if you ever read in the scriptures what happens when people grieve, they do things like rip their hair out and tear their clothes. That tension that might only be relieved by, in my case, just pounding the steering wheel all the way home because I didn't know what else to do. Got home, ran up the steps. My wife met me outside. We just had a long, long hug. And then I went in and hugged my boy's body. Just his body. His soul was gone. Probably had died around 3:30 in the morning. We, again, by God's grace, I didn't know what to really do. I've been at death as a pastor, but I didn't have to do anything really about it. And wasn't sure what to do, but we decided we want to call all of our family. At this point, there were 12 siblings. Two of which were living out of state, and one which was living over up here in Richfield Springs. So we brought all of the kids that were in the house in so they could see Jack's body. We called our kids that were living outside the home to tell them. My wife went over to tell her parents who lived next door. And while she was gone, I called up a friend of mine who's a funeral director who I do a lot of funerals for, because I didn't know what to do at that point. I don't know who to call about the body. We got to do something here. I don't know what to do. So I call him up, and Todd says to me, I'll call the authorities. I'll take care of that. And so I said thank you. What I didn't realize was what would happen next. So understand, no history of any kind of illness in Jack. And we didn't take him to the hospital, so he dies at home. So this immediately becomes a criminal investigation, which after that phone call, within 15 minutes, there were 5 sheriff deputies and a state patrol officer's car in my front yard. And I'm just like, and then they brought the ambulance in because they had to check to see if he was, alive or not. And it just surprised me. What surprised us even more was, after Allison came back over, we told the police there the story. They want us to come down to the sheriff's office to tell the story so they could record it. And my wife went to go get her shoes out of her bedroom where the body was, and they said, you can't go in there. And this is the hardest thing for my wife, is that after she left to go over and tell her parents, she was not able to touch Jack's body again because they had an investigation. they had to come in and do all their stuff. Then they took the body away. And and then they told us, you can't stay here. You got to find a place to stay. They didn't tell us that until we went to the sheriff's office. We both separately told a story. And then we're getting ready to leave. They said, no, you can't go back to your house today until we've investigated all this. So, like, okay. It's just, it was tough. It was tough. But they were good to us. They were really good to us. So this was on a weekend. They don't usually do autopsies on a Sunday. But it happened that the doctor in Albany, where the body was taken for the autopsy, had to do another autopsy, and they got Jack in. So that on Sunday morning, on our way to church, they called me on the cell phone, and they said, we can tell you what happened. And that was a blessing, because that allowed us to tell the congregation that Sunday morning what had happened. And what had happened was, when Jack hit that brake handle, he hit it with such force that it burst his stomach open. And so for the next however many hours that was until 3:30, and your stomach acids are powerful. And basically his body intoxicated, and it killed him that way. So that next morning, this was actually before we left the house, Dr. John called, and he's like, hey, how's Jack doing? And my wife's on the phone, and she's like, well, Jack's dead. And he couldn't believe it. And the reason he couldn't believe it is because he knew how thorough of a checkup he had done. He said, when I touched Jack's body, his belly, he should have just shot up the wall if what they say in the autopsy was true, which there's no reason to think it wasn't. He also comforted us with this. He said, listen, unless you had had a helicopter in your front yard, the minute that accident happened, there was no way that Jack was ever going to survive. It was just too much trauma. But it began to help us as we found out what happened, looking back on it, to see God's grace in this whole thing. God wanted Jack, for whatever reason, to be home with him. And that's the way he chose to do it. And by his grace, we didn't know that Jack was dying. By his grace, though Jack, I think, had some inkling that something was wrong, Jack didn't have any pain. His faith in God only increased through the night as he kept saying, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. And then a week later, we had a funeral for Jack. And then in Argyle, I'm going to share this again in the morning gathering, but in Argyle, where I live, we have the privilege of burying on your own property. You don't have to actually use a cemetery, so we decided to bury Jack. And so the hardest thing that I have ever done in my life that I know of was dig a grave for my son up on our hill. So that's the story of Jack's death 4 years ago. And I want to link it kind of into this, but before that, if you have any questions about that, anybody have any questions about that might help you clarify anything or anything you're wondering about? Really, and I don't mind talking about these things, so if you do. If not, the transition into don't sing songs with a heavy heart was very immediate. And I've got a number of areas here that we can go with this, and I want to open it up for interaction and discussion about it. But I think I'll just start with this. The thing that was interesting to me on Sunday, that was good, and that people got was people who came up to us on Sunday and interacted with us about. Now this was not 24 hours old yet, they, or it's just 24 hours, I guess, a little over. They, here's what most of them said: I have no idea what you're going through, but I'm praying for you. Which was the best thing that they could say. It acknowledged two things. It acknowledged, number one, that they didn't understand what we were going through. They understood the death of somebody, possibly. They might have had, somebody in their family died. They might understand an accidental death. They might have even had a sibling die. I don't think anybody in our church has had a child die except in like stillborn. But it acknowledged that we were in a unique spot at that moment, and they weren't trying to make us feel better by saying, hey, I know how that feels. They were acknowledging that we were in pain and that we were allowed to move through that. And I think that's one of the key things in this book and the key things in the Christian life, and we encounter people who are suffering, is letting them suffer. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that in a positive way of allowing them the freedom to press out their emotions. Because when you say to somebody, well, when your first words are, hey, here's the thing I would have hated to hear first, and that it's okay, Jack's in heaven. I know that. I understand that. But at that very moment, that's not what I would want someone else to tell me. I would want them just to say, I have no idea what you're going through, but this is the second part that was good. I'm praying for you. I'm going to talk to God about you. Or I'm here for you if you want to talk. Or just a hug even, or something. There was no attempt to fix my emotions. And that's one of the key things that we got to get after is our purpose is not to fix people's emotions when they're in suffering. That's God. That's what God's going to do. But we do have things that we should do, and that's the other part of it is, so on one level, we have a temptation to try and fix the problem, and on the other side, we have the temptation to avoid. Now, over the course of 4 years, I'm going to say that this has not been done well, and it's been very hard for me. I have one friend, he's actually a mentor, who will ask me on any kind of regular basis, and I could say maybe every other month, how you doing in your journey of grief? Now, at the anniversary of it, a couple months back, there were a number of people who sent cards or mentioned something, but very few, if any, people have been willing to walk along that journey and just say, hey, how's it going? What's going on? And it makes it kind of challenging because I don't want to present that to people if they don't seem really interested. I mean, this is my journey of grief, and I don't want them to be like, hey, get over it already. So I'm not, I for a few months after the initial death of Jack, posted some things on Facebook, but then I just said, I'm going to pull back from that. If people are interested, they want to know, they want to journey along with us, they will move into my life to do that. That was my hope anyway, based on things that I understood. So the problem is, what would be the problem with, why would people, I'm going to let you talk now, why would people not engage me? What would be some reasons people might not come up to me and say, hey, how are things going with your journey of grief? All right, that's the fear of opening up a wound. The fear that, there's a scab over this wound and I'm going to pull that off. That's good. We're going to come to that. I'm going to talk about that.
Fear of not knowing what to say.
That's a big one too. What do I say? I haven't gone through this. I don't know what to say. Okay. Got to have an answer. By God's grace, here's the one thing that nobody has yet said to me, and I am so glad because it probably would trigger a temper that I have. no one has said to me yet, God's going to make something really good happen out of this. Now, that may be true. I don't know. But I realized early on that I don't need to justify God doesn't need to justify Jack's death, right? If God wants to take Jack because God loves Jack, then that's all that matters. He doesn't have to make anything else come out of it. So yeah, we don't know what to say. What do I say? Or what if I say the wrong thing, right? What if I just say the thing that's going to set them off? Happens with my wife a lot. Somebody, something will happen or something will be said, and we were taking my son and his girlfriend out for dinner, and we took them to a place. I wasn't even thinking about this when I said, let's go there. It's a place in town called Jack's. We pull in, she's like, I hate every time I drive by here because I see that. And unfortunately, Jack's a very popular name, so it's all over the place, right? All right, any other reasons we might not say something? Okay. All right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not crying all the time, unless I'm telling the story maybe. Yeah, I've gotten past it. So that's good. That's what we want, right? We want people to get past it. We want them to get over it. That's sort of the mentality that's out there. Any other reasons you might think of? Well, let's just address some of those. Let me just kind of talk through and think with you about some of those. What was yours again? Fear of opening up a wound. And that's a really good one, especially as you move on and on through it. Because what I've come to understand is, for me at least, and again, I want to be careful because one of the things I've realized in this is that everybody's got a unique story. Within less than a year of Jack's death, someone called me up and said, hey, somebody's lost a 9-year-old son in an accident and just wondered if you would be available if they want someone to talk with who can identify with it. I'm like, yeah, it's fine, but here's what happened to this boy. Dad pulls off on the side of the road in their truck because it's not working or something, and he gets out on the traffic side of the truck and gets hit by a semi. So that's different. It's very different than what I experienced, right? Another person I know, they had a daughter who went through over a year of battling cancer before she succumbed to it. That's very different still. They can be the same age even. It's still very different. Death stories are so unique, so I want to be careful and not project this onto everybody that you're going to meet. I'm just going to say how I have wrestled with that issue is... for me, that's not a reality, and I'm not sure that it is for most people. In other words, the idea there is I've sort of kind of put Jack's death out of my mind. I've kind of passed it, and when you say something, you bring something back. For me, that is not true. I think about Jack every single day. And most weeks at least, sometime during the week, that story I just told you is replayed in my mind. So it's not as if, while his body's buried, it's not as if Jack is buried in my life. He is always right there. We have a picture of him in our house. We didn't build a shrine, but we did keep a pair of tennis shoes out that just meant a lot to us. But we have other memories of him. We have kids who talk about him. I mean, Jack's always there. There's not a wound that's covered up that's being opened up again when you ask me a question about him. I mean, I'm faced with it every time somebody says, how many children do you have? What do I say? How many children do I have? It's a tough question. I usually say I got 14. Now, the relationship and situation I'm in will depend on whether I tell them any more than that. But there's some of my siblings who have a hard time saying I've got 13 siblings. They'd rather just say I've got 12 because it doesn't, they don't have to deal with that up there. But I would view it this way. So I have a hole in my arm right here. Where is it? This side? It's one of these sides. I had a shot when I was a kid. Over the course of years, many, many years, an abscess formed in that hole. And I had to have, underneath the skin, and I had to have a doctor poke a hole in there and get all that stuff out of there. My kids like the hole because they always like to put their finger in it. Can I put my finger in your hole? But my Jack wound is more like that, which is this. My hole is growing from the inside out, and maybe at some day there'll be skin over top again. But it's coming from the inside out. With a scab, the scab is more, we think of it more as covering over the top, right? So that's a good point, and that's where people struggle. And I would just say, don't, when you're interacting with people, be too concerned about that. And the way you say it might make a difference. But you're not likely bringing up something that they have not thought about in the last week or two, especially when they're only a couple years out like we are, 4 years out from it. All right, another one was, don't know what to say, or I might say the wrong thing. Now, this goes in two ways, two directions. One of them is, if I say the wrong thing, I am going to feel awkward or bad, right? That happens. Or if they don't respond the way I'd like them to, I'm going to feel bad. Now, the problem with that is that's very much about me. And when you're ministering to somebody who's suffering, it's not really about you, it's about them. The other side of that is I might say the wrong thing and it might hurt the person. And that's true. Yes?
Along with that, I would say my personal struggle is I feel like I need to have a person.
All right. Yes, and that's exactly, that's right where I'm going with it. If you come up and say the wrong thing to me, and by wrong, it doesn't mean that what you said was wrong, but that particular circumstance at that moment, it may be of no help to me. What is helpful is to know that you're interested, that you care enough that you're going to say something. I would rather have that than nothing. I'd rather have a communication that I understand is a little awkward and you're not quite able to say it, or it's just not getting through to me. I was at our One Life church, and the pastor's wife had this picture that she had found of Jesus and a little boy, looked like he was probably 7 or 8, walking by him, and it just reminded her of Jack and our situation, and she wanted me to have it. And I'm like, thank you. But I could tell in her response to that it hadn't meant as much to me as she had hoped it would. And I said to her, Bethany, listen, I really appreciate that this made you think of us and that you gave this to me. You just have to understand it's not doing anything for me right now. And you need to be okay with that. And if you can be okay with that, then this can be a redemptive moment. If this is going to throw you that I haven't got all excited about this or gone teary-eyed or had some kind of emotional response to it, then this is not going to work well. And she understood that, to her credit. So when you bring something to somebody, you give them a note or you encourage them in some way, and they just like blank or even get frustrated, it doesn't have to be you. Again, it's not about you, right? It's about them. And it's about helping them. Now, if you're in a marriage, you understand this already. Because there's a lot of times when you interact with your spouse and you're hoping for some kind of response and it's not there. It doesn't make you a bad spouse. It just means whatever reason, that didn't work out. That wasn't the thing that they needed. When she gave me that, I didn't really need that at that moment. It was not of any help to me. So yeah, and then so to your statement, you don't have to try and fix anything. You don't have to try and solve this or anything. You just have to say, I'm right here, and I'm going to listen, and I'm going to do anything that you might need. What was another one? You had one over here? What was yours? Oh, yes. Yeah. If you've gotten past that, it's all okay. And that kind of goes in line a little bit with your issue of like opening up a wound, you know. One of the things that happened after Jack died, I knew that there was a couple in our church who 30 years before that, their 18-year-old son had died in a car accident. And so I went over to their house because I wanted to understand something. This was very fresh, and I could not imagine in my mind living 30 years without Jack. I still have a hard time imagining that. How am I going to do that, 30 years without my son? And so I just wanted, to understand how this happened for them. How is it that you are able to, 30 years later, still be a vibrant, strong Christian, even after this loss? And so I just spent some time, but one of the things I realized as I was talking with them is that you're never over it. You're not over it. And in fact, it was interesting, their grandson had been in a car accident. They had gotten a phone call, so-and-so's been in a car accident, and she told me, she said, immediately she was back in the morgue where she and her husband had to walk in and identify the body of their son who'd been in a car accident. Just like that. 30 years later, it was still vivid. So you're not over it. You don't get over it. And so don't assume people are over it. And this is what I like to just encourage us to address people this way. What's happening right now in your grief journey? What's happening in my grief journey right now is very different than what happened 3 years ago or 2 years ago. I'll tell you what, 3 years ago, before my son Izzy was born, here was the thing that was most worrisome to me. I'm going to have a child born who is never going to meet Jack. How is that going to work? And again, what I did was I contacted somebody I knew who had had a young child die and had had children after that, and I just said, how did this work for you? What happened? So what I was thinking about back then is very different than what I'm thinking about now. So it never ends, but investing yourself in somebody and just saying, and here's the other thing with that, don't assume that everybody else, and especially their close friends, are doing it or their family. None of not my family, like my family, but none of my siblings or my parents ever asked me about it. And so don't assume that their family's asking them. Don't assume that their close friends are asking them. If God is laying on your heart to talk to somebody who you know is suffering, and not just the death of a child, this could be any kind of suffering, go. And again, you may just be there for one time. It may be that doesn't come upon you again. Don't plan this out like I'm going to have a meeting with them every month and check up on them and see how they're doing or anything. God may just be saying, I want you to go today because today they need you. And what they need you to ask is, where are you at in your grief journey? I just want to hear about it. And you just tell me what's going on. And then let them tell you at whatever level they want. And the great thing is then, all you have to do is affirm. You don't have to give them any suggestions. You don't have to try and fix anything unless they ask you, which they probably won't. They just want to talk about it. Because who else are they going to talk about it to? They talk to their spouse about it, and that's good. But after a while, you feel like it's just the two of you in this, and nobody else is involved at all. And we are a community, and we have a community responsibility. Any other questions or comments? I know we're running out of time here, but I don't want to leave you without any. Yes. What would I say to them?
Yeah, to the parents. In other words, if it's a child to their parent,
Well,
you can't relate to them.
Yeah, I guess I would just tell you my experience. That's all I can tell you. I can't. I would just tell you my experience has been to communicate to Izzy, who's 3 right now, in a fairly normal way that he has this brother. He knows there's a picture up there. We talk about Jack, and accept. This is what has been a struggle for me. Accept that he will never have the relationship with Jack that everybody else was able to have. I have to accept that. So I think that would be my counsel is ask God to help you come to a point where you can accept that and it not be frustrating. Because it is frustrating. Jack was a great kid. And he has a brother. He has a blood brother who I wish that, they would have a relationship. But their only relationship is going to come through us. The other thing about that is we try to accurately portray Jack. Jack is not a saint in the way we think of saints. Right? He had his flaws. He had his idiosyncrasies, and we share those with Izzy. And Izzy knows where he is. Izzy knows he's in heaven. He doesn't fully understand what all that means, but he knows that Jack is part of our family, but he doesn't live with us because he's with Jesus. And so, yeah.
With it, who was on the bike in front of him and stopped?
Initially, he asked, how did the brother, Zebedee, his brother who was on the bike in front of him, respond and deal with it? And there's two factors that are difficult here. Number one, Zeb is 12, Jack would have been 10. So they're 2 years apart, so they were best buddies. And his next oldest brother is 7 years older, and his next youngest brother is 4 years younger. Zeb got left, hanging. By the way, this was a frustration for me with God for a long time. You just left Zeb hanging. He's got nobody close to him. His initial reaction was to sort of take some guilt, some blame for it, and we cut that immediately. Zeb, this is not your fault. This has nothing that you did was wrong. You were riding along, and Jack was too close to you, and Jack didn't pay attention. This is not your fault. He accepted that, and I think he has accepted that, so I've not heard from him anything related to that. All we get from Zeb really is that he really misses not having his best friend. He died in September. In October, we went to a lake house that somebody provided for us just to get away. And then Zeb, we got out and we kind of were exploring, and Zeb's like, man, Jack would have loved to explore this with me, So it's just a missing. But we cut that other right away. And the same thing with his grandfather. His grandfather lived next door, started I should have told those kids not to be riding so crazy. And I said, no, there's nothing you needed to do. There's nothing any of us needed to do. That's why it was called an accident. This didn't happen on purpose. And it didn't happen out of foolishness. It's just some kids out riding, and one of them didn't pay careful enough attention. And because I believe in the sovereignty of God, I don't have to wrestle with how could that have turned out different. It just wasn't going to turn out different. God wanted Jack to be with him, and he chose that particular way to take him. Could have chosen any other way, but that's the way he took him. So, does that help? Anybody else? And tell me when I got to stop, because I'll just keep going. Oh, boy. Yeah, some of that comes if they bring it up. If they haven't brought it up in a while, I'll sometimes, or Allison, one of us, will kind of bring it up. But I would say they tend more often to bring something up, and just because we've kept an open relationship with them in terms of communication. So my kids, the question was how do we ensure that we're able to see how our kids are doing with this whole thing, ongoing. And the biggest is just they know we're available to come and talk and to share what they might be struggling with. And again, we haven't pushed Jack away. So he comes up at the supper table. He comes up when something happens that reminds us of him. And our kids understand that none of us are afraid to say his name. So, did you have a question?
It's a pretty big one, so I don't know if it's one to be addressed right now. But as you were talking, I was thinking, people talk about different reasons why we don't speak up. And I'll say for myself, I recognize not just with death, but just with things you're struggling with that aren't even that big. I don't speak up because I'm selfish. Because I'm thinking about my life, I'm thinking about me and my struggle. And it's embarrassing to say, I'm such an awful person. Someone else has a to death in their life, and 6 months later, I got bigger things in my life than you're hurt.
Yeah.
And would you recognize that sinful nature in yourself? I wonder what you might say. I don't know, what can you say to somebody to help them become more like Christ when you lead people, instead of being so selfish you don't even think of other people's hurts 6 months, a year down the road.
Right.
And then you kind of addressed this other one, but I wanted to throw out there in case you had something more you could say, is how, because you kind of said just call it prompting your spirit to the second thing I'm going to say here, but
You what?
people hurt, and I wonder if someone does, if I do know someone has an anniversary of death coming up, but it's 10 years since their dad died, do you make a book for people to remember when they're, you seem to say kind of no, don't make a book, don't make a ritual of it for people who had death, only if the Lord prompts you to follow up. Was I hearing you right in that second part? I don't want to lose it.
Yeah, so here's what I experienced and what I've, in reading, what I would say. One of the things that people who experience, particularly a death suffering, again, there's a lot of kind of suffering, but particularly a death suffering, is when you say something about your relationship with the person that died that's positive, that brings a lot of encouragement to people. Now, Jack didn't have a lot of friends, actually, in our church. It's kind of ironic. But if somebody, and people have done this at times, they have a memory of Jack and they'll just share that. That's really helpful. And that doesn't immortalize him in a certain way. And it also doesn't require a response from me other than, thank you, I appreciate that. That's great to know. So I think that's a really helpful way to do that. Related to your first issue, that's a walking in the Spirit issue because, like I said earlier, you don't have to feel like you're their personal counselor who has to come alongside them, especially if you don't know them that well. But you are, and I'm just talking here about believers, okay? If you are their fellow saint, you have some sort of responsibility if the Spirit of God tells you that. A problem that selfish people a lot of times have is they're not walking in the Spirit, so they're not even hearing when God's telling them, like, go do that. Then the other people have the issue of they're hearing that impression, but they're afraid to do it, or they're not convinced that, they haven't walked enough in the Spirit to know for sure, like, yeah, that's God talking to me. So that issue, I think, is dealt with through repentance and walking in the Spirit. That makes me sensitive to, at whatever point God points me to a person to talk to them, I do that. And I'm learning that in my life still. I still, like, I'll go by someplace and I think I should stop and talk to that person, but I got this to do. And then later in the afternoon, I'm like, I know I was supposed to. I know I was supposed to. I blew it, right? Now, I can't end the world that way, but I have chosen not to, in some way, build up one of God's people when he told me to do it. So it's like, I tell my child, like, pick up those toys. He may not do it right then. He might do it later, but again, he just has not obeyed me at that very point. And so that's a walking in the Spirit issue, yeah. And you tell me what you want.
We should probably wrap it up now.
Let me wrap up something here then out of this this book. These are seven sincere actions that I would encourage you to consider. Genuine prayer. So, just start praying for the person. Just start praying for them. If God wants you to be the one involved in their life, as you pray, that will become very clear to you. But I tell you, the thing that got us through, I'm convinced, the early hours was as soon as our pastor heard about this, he opened the church up and encouraged people to come to pray. He didn't tell them what it was about even. He just said, there has been a tragedy in our church. People need prayer. And so the church began to pray in those very early hours when we were wrestling with the police and trying to deal with all of that, right? So pray, show up. Just Just be there with them. Don't shun them. Even like on Sunday morning, just sit next to them. If you know they're suffering and there's something in their life, just sit down next to them. You don't have to say anything. It's a weird thing with death that if you're a pastor, you'll see, or if you're a caretaker, you'll see. As people are in the dying process in their bed, their family moves from the head of the bed down to the foot of the bed. There's a movement away from death because we instinctively move away from that. Don't move away from people who are suffering. They need you to move toward them. Name the elephant. This is back to the ripping off the Band-Aid. You're not ripping off a Band-Aid, you're just acknowledging a hole that's already there. So don't try to talk around the death of the child. Just say, hey, I know Jackson died, and it's hard for you, I'm sure. Would you like to share with me anything about what's going on? And if they say, no, I'd rather not, then take that as a no and go, that's fine, and just want you to know I'm available to do that if you ever want to, okay? Reminisce, that's what I was talking about, like tell them about memories you have. Ask them how they are doing. This isn't about you. Now remember, all of our church also had to wrestle with some kind of grieving process because Jack belonged to all of us. And it was interesting, and I know I'm taking way too much time, but this was really significant. Out of all of the hugs that I got on Sunday morning, and I got a lot of them, a lot of people hugging me, people who never hugged me before. Now, I'm the hugging guy at our church, but out of all of those hugs, 70% of them I recognized were not for me. They were for the person hugging me. They needed to know life was still okay. Because this had hit them as a tragedy as well, not just me. I know it's my son and all that, but they are being shook up now. They've got to wrestle with questions like, I've got a 5-year-old son. What if God decided to take him? They've got to wrestle with questions or issues like, my child got taken, or things like that. And so one of the things to recognize is that other people are hurting as well. And maybe your job is not to talk to me about the death of my child. It might be to talk to someone else in your church about the death of someone else's child. You understand what I mean by that? You might need to ask someone else, how are you dealing with that person's grief? How is that interacting in your life? Practical help, if you can do it. And then the last one, I think, is just follow up. It never ends. It never ends. Especially when it's accidental and young. We expect, I was talking with a guy yesterday, and a question that got asked him was, what big change you think is going to come in the next 5 years? And I think in our family, it's going to be the death of one of our parents, just because of where they're at age-wise and health-wise. I imagine in the next 5 years, at least one of our parents will die. But that's kind of expected, right? It's not anticipated. I never thought that September 14th, when I woke up in the morning, that my son Jack would be dead the next day. It never crossed my mind. I'll tell you what, it does now. It crosses my mind when my kids get in an accident now. Jack the other day fell out of the tree. Jed fell out of the tree, and he was panicked because he knew what the result of this could be. And I was fighting panic, and my wife was like, it's okay, it's not as bad. So, anyway, there you go.
where we are